The story begins under the haunting glow of twilight as the swamps surrounding Cypress Hollow settle into an eerie quiet. The chirping of insects fills the air, punctuated only by the occasional croak of frogs or the distant rustle of unseen creatures moving through the dense underbrush. For most, the swamps are a place of dread, a sprawling, unpredictable wilderness where nature reigns supreme. But for Kira Mitchell, this is home. Kira is no ordinary woman. In her late 30s, she carries the hardened resilience of someone who has faced adversity her entire life. A former military K9 handler with over a decade of service, she had trained some of the most effective working dogs in the country. Her methods were unconventional but transformative, rooted in patience, trust, and mutual respect. Unlike others in her field, Kira viewed her canine partners not as tools but as equals. It was this philosophy that earned her both admiration and ire during her time in the military. But after an incident overseas that left her emotionally scarred and disillusioned with institutional hierarchies, she left the service, retreating to the swamps where she could live quietly, far from the judgments of society. Cypress Hollow is a small southern town teetering on the edge of modernity and decay. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. Outsiders are rare, and those who don't fit the mold are often treated with suspicion. Kira, as a black woman living alone on the outskirts of town, has long been the subject of whispered rumors. Some think she's an eccentric recluse. Others suspect she's hiding something. In truth, Kira's life is dedicated to protecting the land and the animals that inhabit it. She's a volunteer conservationist, often working with local wildlife organizations to track endangered species and rescue abandoned pets that are dumped in the swamps. But her quiet advocacy has made her enemies, particularly among a shadowy network of poachers and corrupt officials who profit from the exploitation of the land. One of these men is Officer Brad Thompson, recently transferred to Cypress Hollow from a larger precinct. Brad arrived with a reputation for aggressive policing and a chip on his shoulder. His colleagues describe him as a tough enforcer, but behind the badge lies a deeply insecure man with a dangerous cocktail of resentment, prejudice, and a thirst for control. Brad was given command of a K9 unit. Shortly after his arrival, a German shepherd named Max, who had been trained by none other than Kira Mitchell during her military service. But under Brad's heavy-handed methods, Max has become withdrawn and unpredictable. Frustrated by the dog's refusal to obey him, Brad projects his failures onto Max, treating him with contempt. Brad is not only a bad handler, he's also a man with a grudge. The town's wealthier residents, many of whom profit from illegal hunting operations in the swamps, have quietly encouraged Brad to keep an eye on Kira. Her conservation efforts have disrupted their operations, and they view her as a nuisance. Brad, eager to prove his worth and assert his dominance, sees Kira as an easy target. On this particular evening, Kira is returning home from a routine patrol of the swamps. She drives an old pickup truck, its bed loaded with supplies, bags of dog food, medical kits, and tracking equipment. The truck's headlights cut through the thickening fog as she navigates the winding dirt roads that lead to her modest cabin. Despite her calm demeanor, Kira is on high alert. She's been feeling watched lately, an unsettling intuition honed by years of military service. The poachers have been unusually active, and she knows better than to dismiss the possibility of danger. Unbeknownst to Kira, Brad has been trailing her for the past hour. From his squad car parked in the shadows, he watches as her truck disappears into the dense foliage. He grips the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. To Brad, this is more than a routine patrol, it's an opportunity. He's been itching for a confrontation, convinced that Kira's quiet defiance is a direct challenge to his authority. Tonight, he intends to remind her who's in charge. As Kira pulls into her driveway, she notices something unusual. The gates to her property, which she always leaves closed, are slightly ajar. Her pulse quickens as she scans the area. The dense fog obscures her view, but her instincts tell her she's not alone. She steps out of the truck cautiously, her hand brushing against the flashlight clipped to her belt. The swamp is eerily silent, a silence that feels heavy, expectant. Suddenly, the sound of gravel crunching under tires breaks the stillness. Kira turns to see the glaring headlights of Brad's patrol car cutting through the fog. The vehicle stops just short of her driveway, and Brad steps out, his posture radiating hostility. He's a large man with a perpetual scowl etched into his face, his uniform straining against his stocky frame. His hand rests on the holster of his sidearm, a calculated gesture meant to intimidate. "Evening, ma'am," Brad says, his tone dripping with insincerity. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here at this hour?" Kira doesn't flinch. She's dealt with men like Brad before, men who wield authority like a weapon. "This is my property, officer," she replies evenly. "I'm just coming home." Brad steps closer, invading her space. "Funny. I've been hearing some interesting things about you, Miss Mitchell. Seems like you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. You wouldn't happen to know anything about the vandalized hunting camps we've been finding, would you?" Kira's jaw tightens, but she maintains her composure. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," she says, her voice steady. "I'm just trying to protect the land from people who don't respect it." Brad chuckles, but there's no humor in it. "That's a noble cause," he says, his tone mocking. "But see, some folks around here don't take kindly to vigilantes. Maybe it's time someone taught you a lesson." Before Kira can respond, Brad takes another step closer. Max, still in the patrol car, begins to bark a deep, guttural sound that echoes through the night. Brad's expression darkens. "Shut up," he snaps, turning to glare at the dog. But Max doesn't stop. His barking grows more frantic, almost as if he's warning Kira of what's to come. Kira senses the danger escalating. She knows that men like Brad thrive on fear, and she refuses to give him the satisfaction. But as the tension between them thickens, one thing becomes clear. This is only the beginning of a night that will test her in ways she could never have anticipated. The night deepens, and the air around Kira's property grows heavier with tension. The glow of Brad's patrol car headlights casts long, sinister shadows on the ground, illuminating Kira's wary expression as she stands firm in her driveway. The barks from Max inside the patrol car grow louder, almost desperate, and Kira's sharp ears pick up on the subtle change in the dog's tone. It's not aggression, this is a call for help, a warning that something isn't right. Brad steps forward again, now within arm's reach of Kira, his hand still resting deliberately on his holstered weapon. His smirk is gone, replaced with an unsettling look of determination. "I'm not going to ask again, Mitchell," he growls. "You've been poking around where you don't belong. I don't care what kind of do-gooder story you tell yourself about saving the swamp. Out here you answer to me." Kira doesn't back down. Her years in the military taught her how to handle men who weaponize their authority, and she knows the worst thing she could do is show fear. "I don't answer to anyone who abuses their power," she replies coolly, her voice unwavering. "Especially not someone who has no respect for the law they claim to uphold." Brad's face flushes with anger. He isn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Kira, a woman, a black woman, who refuses to yield to his intimidation. "You think you're clever, huh?" he sneers. "You think you can just mouth off to a cop and get away with it?" Max's barking grows frantic, the noise cutting through the thick silence of the swamp. Kira glances at the car. and for a split second, her gaze softens. She recognizes the dog's distress. It's the same reaction she's seen in countless canines who've been mishandled and mistreated. She knows Max isn't the enemy here, he's a victim, just like the land and creatures Brad is supposed to protect. Brad notices her looking at the dog, and his anger flares even hotter. "Don't even think about it," he snaps. "That dog doesn't answer to you anymore." But the words ring hollow. Kira doesn't need to say anything. The bond she once shared with Max is still there, flickering beneath the surface. Brad abruptly pulls his gun from its holster, though he doesn't aim it at Kira yet. The gesture is meant to assert dominance, to remind her who's in control. "Here's what's going to happen," he says, his voice low and venomous. "You're going to come with me for questioning. There's been too much trouble in these parts lately, and I've got every reason to believe you're behind it." Kira raises an eyebrow, refusing to let her calm demeanor slip. "On what grounds?" she asks, her tone cutting like steel. "You don't have a warrant. You don't even have a reason to detain me. What you're doing is harassment." Brad's smirk returns, cruel and vindictive. "You think I need a warrant out here? Who's going to stop me?" "You?" He lets out a humorless laugh. "Lady, no one's coming to save you. We're miles away from the nearest neighbor, and even if someone could hear you scream, they wouldn't lift a finger." Before Kira can respond, Brad lunges forward and grabs her arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced brutality. She winces but doesn't cry out, refusing to give him the satisfaction. "You're under arrest," he declares, though his voice lacks the professionalism of someone following protocol. "This isn't about the law, this is personal." As he drags her toward his patrol car, Max's barking reaches a fever pitch. The dog is practically throwing himself against the interior of the car, his claws scraping at the windows in a desperate attempt to get out. Kira's heart aches at the sight. Despite the immediate danger she's in, her instincts as a handler kick in. "Max," she calls out, her voice firm but laced with warmth. The dog freezes for a moment, his ears perking up at the sound of her voice. Brad notices the interaction and tightens his grip on Kira's arm. "Shut your mouth," he snaps. "That dog doesn't belong to you anymore." But Kira's voice remains steady, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "He doesn't belong to you either," she counters. "You think you can control him with fear, but that's not how loyalty works." Brad shoves her roughly into the back seat of his patrol car, slamming the door behind her. "We'll see about that," he mutters, more to himself than to her. As he climbs into the driver's seat, he pauses to glare at Max, who's now whining and pawing at the partition separating the front and back of the car. "Shut up, you useless mutt," Brad growls, banging his fist on the dashboard. Kira sits silently in the back seat, her mind racing. She knows Brad isn't taking her to the station, not yet, at least. His threats about no one coming to save her weren't idle. He's planning something, and she needs to be ready for whatever comes next. She scans the interior of the car, taking mental inventory of her surroundings. Her hands are cuffed, but her military training taught her how to escape worse situations than this. The patrol car lurches forward, bouncing along the uneven dirt road as Brad drives deeper into the swamp. The fog thickens, swallowing the narrow path ahead and casting an almost otherworldly glow under the headlights. Kira watches the landscape change, the dense trees giving way to murky water and tangled vines. She knows this area well. It's one of the most remote parts of the swamp, far from any marked trails or human activity. After what feels like an eternity, Brad slams on the brakes, causing the car to skid to a stop. He gets out without a word, opening the back door and yanking Kira out with a force that nearly knocks her off her feet. The ground beneath her boots is soft and wet, the unmistakable squelch of mud threatening to pull her down with every step. Brad drags her to the edge of a shallow marsh, his grip like a vise on her arm. "This is where you belong," he sneers. "Out here with the rest of the trash." He shoves her forward, and she stumbles, falling to her knees in the mud. The cold, wet earth seeps through her clothes, but she forces herself to stay calm. "Your badge doesn't make you untouchable," she says, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "People like you always slip up eventually." Brad's expression darkens. "You're a slow learner, aren't you?" he says, pulling out a pair of zip ties. He binds her wrists even tighter, his movements rough and unforgiving. "Let's see how tough you are when no one's around to hear you cry." He tosses her into the marsh with a final shove, the muddy water splashing up around her. Without another word, he turns back toward his car, leaving her there in the darkness. Max's barking grows distant as the patrol car's engine roars to life, and soon, all that remains is the oppressive silence of the swamp. But Kira doesn't panic. As she struggles against the restraints, her mind sharpens, focused entirely on survival. She knows the terrain better than Brad ever could. And if he thinks she's helpless, he's made a critical mistake. This isn't over. It's only just begun. The oppressive silence of the swamp presses down on Kira as she watches Brad's patrol car disappear into the fog, its taillights fading like embers swallowed by darkness. She sits in the cold mud, her hands bound tightly behind her with zip ties that dig into her wrists. The wet earth clings to her clothes, and the biting chill of the water seeps into her skin. But her mind is a storm, sharp and unyielding. Panic has no place here. She has been in life or death situations before, and the swamp may be treacherous, but it is familiar ground for her. It is Brad who is out of his depth, not her. Kira shifts slightly, testing the restraints. The zip ties bite into her skin, but she ignores the pain. Her years in the military taught her that every obstacle has a weakness. Her sharp eyes scan her surroundings, taking in the twisted roots of cypress trees and the jagged edges of rocks jutting out of the muddy ground. She needs something sharp to cut through the plastic, and she needs it fast. The swamp is alive with sound, now a symphony of chirping insects, croaking frogs, and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Every noise seems amplified in the darkness, a reminder that she is not alone. Her breath is steady, her movements calculated. Rolling onto her side, she inches toward the nearest tree, where a tangle of exposed roots rises above the waterline. The sharp edges of the bark catch her eye, and she knows it's her best chance. Her progress is slow, the mud sucks at her clothes, resisting every movement, but she refuses to give in. Inch by inch, she closes the distance until she can press the zip ties against the jagged root. The plastic resists at first, but she grinds it harder, using her weight to add pressure. Sweat mixes with the mud on her skin as she works, the minutes stretching into what feels like hours. Finally, the ties snap with a sharp crack, and her hands are free. Kira wastes no time rubbing at her sore wrists. Instead, she grabs a sturdy branch from the ground and uses it to pull herself to her feet. Her muscles protest, stiff from the cold and exertion, but she pushes through the discomfort. Survival depends on movement. Standing still is death out here. She knows Brad is underestimating her. Men like him always do. To him, she's just another nuisance, someone he can intimidate into submission. But Brad has made a fatal mistake. He's left her in a terrain she knows better than anyone. The swamp may be unforgiving, but it is also a place of refuge for those who understand its secrets. Kira has spent years studying this land, its paths, its dangers, and its resources. If Brad thinks he's won, he's about to learn just how wrong he is. As she takes her first steps, the mud squelching beneath her boots, A low, familiar sound reaches her ears. It's faint at first, barely audible over the cacophony of the swamp, but it grows louder as she focuses. A bark. Not a warning bark, but a distressed one. Kira's heart skips a beat. "Max," she whispers under her breath. She turns toward the sound, her instincts guiding her through the dense foliage. The barks grow more frantic as she approaches, and soon she sees him, Max, the German shepherd, standing at the edge of the marsh where Brad had left her. His paws are caked in mud, and his ears swivel toward every noise, as if searching for her. When he sees her, his body stiffens, his tail lowering slightly in uncertainty. Kira stops a few feet away, her voice soft and steady. "Max," she says gently, her hand extended. "It's me." The dog hesitates, his amber eyes locked on hers. Kira can see the conflict in his posture, the lingering fear from Brad's heavy-handed training battling with the trust they once shared. She crouches slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. "It's okay," she murmurs. "You're safe now." Max takes a tentative step forward, then another. Kira holds her breath, waiting. Finally, he closes the distance, pressing his wet nose into her palm. Relief floods through her as she scratches behind his ears, her touch light but reassuring. "Good boy," she whispers. "You remember me, don't you?" Max whines softly, leaning into her touch. Kira knows she doesn't have much time. Brad will eventually realize his dog is missing, and when he does, he'll come back. She needs to act quickly, but she also needs Max, not just as an ally, but as a symbol of everything Brad has tried to corrupt. She ties a strip of fabric from her torn shirt around his collar, a makeshift leash to keep him close. "Let's move," she says, her voice firm now. Max follows without hesitation, his loyalty to Brad shattered by the handler who had shown him nothing but cruelty. Kira leads him deeper into the swamp, her every step calculated to avoid detection. She knows the poachers' camps aren't far from here, hidden among the dense trees and murky waters. These camps are the heart of everything wrong with Cypress Hollow, a network of illegal hunting operations protected by men like Brad. If she can find evidence of their activities, she can bring the whole operation down. But first, she needs to stay alive. As they move, the swamp comes alive in new ways. The distant bellow of an alligator sends a chill down her spine, but she presses on, keeping Max close. The dog seems to sense her urgency, his ears constantly swiveling as he scans their surroundings. The bond between them grows with every step, the trust they once shared rekindling in the face of danger. They reach the edge of a clearing, where the faint glow of firelight flickers through the trees. Kira drops to her knees, pulling Max down with her. She peers through the foliage and sees it, a poacher's camp, complete with makeshift tents, stacks of animal pelts, and cages filled with live animals. The sight turns her stomach, but she forces herself to stay focused. She counts 3 men near the fire, their rifles leaning against a tree nearby. Voices drift through the air, their words indistinct but their laughter loud and crude. Kira's mind races. She needs a plan. Charging in headfirst is suicide, but she can't leave without doing something. Her eyes scan the camp, noting every detail, the position of the men, the placement of their supplies, the paths leading in and out. She spots a stack of gasoline canisters near one of the tents, and an idea begins to form. Turning to Max, she whispers, "Stay here." The dog tilts his head, watching her intently. Kira grabs a heavy stick from the ground and slips into the shadows, her movements silent and deliberate. She circles the camp, staying out of the firelight, until she reaches the canisters. Carefully, she loosens the caps on 2 of them, letting the pungent smell of fuel fill the air. Then she grabs a nearby torch and tosses it onto the ground near the canisters before retreating into the shadows. The explosion is immediate, a deafening roar that sends flames shooting into the sky. The poachers scatter, shouting in panic as the fire consumes their supplies. Kira uses the chaos to her advantage, slipping back to Max and leading him toward the cages. She frees as many animals as she can, her hands trembling with adrenaline as she works. By the time the poachers regain their senses, Kira and Max are gone, vanished into the swamp. But the damage is done. The camp is in ruins, and the evidence she needs is scattered among the wreckage. She knows it's only a matter of time before Brad finds out, and when he does, he'll come for her with everything he has. But Kira is ready. She isn't just surviving anymore, she's fighting back. The swamp hums with an eerie stillness in the aftermath of Kira's calculated strike against the poachers' camp. The orange glow of the fire she ignited fades into the distance as she and Max press further into the swamp, their breaths heavy but synchronized. Kira knows her actions have sent a message one Brad and his network won't ignore, but she also knows retaliation will come swiftly and brutally. Brad isn't the kind of man to let a challenge go unanswered, and now he'll be desperate to regain control. Max moves beside her with newfound purpose, his posture alert yet calm. Despite the danger, Kira feels a flicker of warmth. The bond they shared during their military days is rekindling with every step. His loyalty isn't driven by fear or obligation, it's rooted in trust, a trust Brad had tried to sever but couldn't destroy. She runs her fingers through his thick fur briefly, a silent promise that they'll make it out of this together. The terrain grows more treacherous as they delve deeper into the swamp. Tangled roots claw at the muddy ground, and pools of stagnant water shimmer faintly under the pale moonlight. Every sound carries a new layer of tension, the distant splash of something moving in the water, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Kira's senses are razor sharp, her years of survival training guiding her movements. She knows this part of the swamp well. It's remote, uncharted by most, and riddled with natural hazards. It's also the perfect place to plan her next move. Eventually they reach a dry patch of land surrounded by dense cypress trees, their gnarled roots forming a natural barrier. Kira crouches, scanning the area for signs of movement. Satisfied they're alone, she sits against one of the trees, her muscles aching from the night's ordeal. Max lies down beside her, his head resting on his paws but his ears perked, ever vigilant. Kira pulls a small flashlight from her belt and examines the items she managed to salvage from the poachers, camp a set of GPS coordinates, scrawled on a scrap of paper, a few grainy photos of captured wildlife, and a ledger detailing transactions. The names in the ledger are coded, but she recognizes some of the numbers, shipment quantities, dates, and dollar amounts that point to a large-scale operation. Brad isn't just a corrupt cop, he's deeply embedded in a criminal network exploiting the swamp for profit. And now she has the proof. Her mind races as she pieces together the puzzle. The GPS coordinates likely lead to another camp or a storage site. If she can reach it, she might find more evidence to dismantle the operation entirely. But the risk is enormous. Brad will already be on high alert, and if he realizes she's still alive, he'll stop at nothing to silence her. She glances at Max, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light of the flashlight. "We're not done yet," she murmurs. The dog tilts his head, as if understanding her determination. The sound of distant voices snaps Kira back to the present. She quickly extinguishes the flashlight and motions for Max to stay low. The voices grow louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on wet ground. Through the dense foliage, she spots flashlights cutting through the darkness. It's a search party. Brad's men, heavily armed and clearly agitated. She torched the whole damn camp. One of them growls, his voice laced with frustration. Boss isn't gonna let this slide. She couldn't have gotten far, another replies. Swamp'll take care of her if we don't. Just keep looking. Kira's grip tightens on the branch she's been using as a makeshift weapon. She considers her options carefully. Engaging them head-on would be suicide, but staying hidden isn't enough. If they find her trail, they'll hunt her relentlessly. She needs to create a distraction. Her eyes fall on a patch of tall grass near a shallow pool of water. She knows the area is home to a particularly aggressive species of snake, one that reacts violently to sudden movements. An idea forms in her mind, a risky, unconventional tactic, but one that might buy her the time she needs. Kira grabs a handful of rocks and tosses them into the grass, her movements precise and deliberate. The rustling noise immediately draws the attention of the search party. Over there, one of the men shouts, his flashlight swinging toward the disturbance. They approach cautiously, their weapons raised, but before they can investigate further, the grass explodes with movement. The snakes, disturbed and agitated, strike out at the intruders. Chaos erupts as the men yell and stumble backward, their flashlights jerking wildly. Kira uses the commotion to slip away, Max following close behind. They move swiftly and silently, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the search party. Kira's heart pounds in her chest, but she doesn't let fear cloud her judgment. Every step is deliberate, every decision calculated. She knows she can't afford a single mistake. After what feels like hours, they reach a narrow creek cutting through the swamp. The water is shallow but fast-moving, and Kira knows it leads to higher ground, a rare feature in this otherwise flat and unforgiving landscape. She leads Max across, the cold water biting at her legs, and climbs the embankment on the other side. From this vantage point, she can see the faint glow of another fire in the distance, likely the location marked by the GPS coordinates she found. Kira takes a deep breath, steadying herself. She's exhausted, but the fire in her chest burns brighter than ever. Brad and his network have underestimated her, and now she has the upper hand. With Max by her side, she feels a renewed sense of purpose. This isn't just about survival anymore, it's about justice. As they approach the second camp, Kira notices something unusual. The area is heavily fortified with makeshift barricades and multiple guards patrolling the perimeter. Unlike the first camp, which was more of a staging ground, this one appears to be a central hub for the operation. The sound of generators hums in the background, powering floodlights that illuminate stacks of crates and cages. Trucks loaded with supplies are parked nearby, their engines idling as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Kira's mind races. She can't take on this many people alone, but she doesn't need to. Her goal isn't to fight, it's to expose. If she can document what's happening here and get the evidence to someone she can trust, it could bring down the entire operation. But first, she needs a way in. She circles the camp, staying low and using the dense foliage as cover. Max moves beside her, his movements silent and precise. As they near the edge of the clearing, Kira spots an opening, a gap in the barricades where one of the guards has left his post. She slips through, her heart pounding as she navigates the maze of crates and equipment. Inside, the scale of the operation becomes clear. The crates are filled with animal pelts, illegal weapons, and stacks of cash. Cages house frightened animals, some injured, others too weak to move. Kira's stomach churns at the sight, but she pushes her emotions aside. She needs to focus. Using the camera on her phone, she begins documenting everything: the inventory, the license plates on the trucks, the faces of the guards. She knows these images will be crucial in exposing the network, but every second she spends here increases the risk of being caught. Max stays close, his ears swiveling as he listens for any sign of danger. Just as she's about to leave, a voice cuts through the air. "Hey, who's there?" Kira freezes, her heart racing as footsteps approach. The guard is only a few feet away, his flashlight sweeping the area. She ducks behind a stack of crates, holding her breath as the light passes over her hiding spot. Max tenses beside her, but he doesn't make a sound. Kira reaches out to steady him, her hand trembling. The guard lingers for a moment, then moves on, muttering something under his breath. Kira exhales slowly, relief washing over her. She knows she can't stay here any longer. With Max leading the way, she slips back through the gap in the barricades and disappears into the swamp. As they retreat, Kira feels a surge of determination. She has the evidence she needs, but she also knows the fight isn't over. Brad and his men will stop at nothing to protect their operation, and the swamp is about to become a battlefield. But Kira isn't afraid. She's ready to face whatever comes next. The swamp feels like it's holding its breath as Kira moves quietly through the dense underbrush, the air thick with the distant rumble of engines and shouted orders. She knows Brad is relentless. The chaos she caused at the second camp will have enraged him beyond reason. Now he'll want more than just to silence her, he'll want to humiliate her, make an example of her, and reclaim control of a situation spiraling beyond his grasp. Max pads silently beside her, his ears twitching at every sound. They share an unspoken understanding now, forged through years of training and renewed under the stress of this night. The bond that Brad tried to break has only grown stronger, and it's that bond that gives Kira her edge. Brad has numbers, guns, and the arrogance of a man who has always wielded power unchecked. But Kira has knowledge of the swamp, the instincts of a survivor, and Max. The swamp shifts underfoot as she moves, the ground becoming wetter and softer with every step. She's deliberately leading Brad's men deeper into the heart of the wetlands, to a place where the terrain itself will become her ally. Every sound carries further here, distorted by the thick vegetation and the still waters. It's a battlefield of her choosing, where every tree and shadow offers a potential advantage. The first sign of pursuit comes in the form of faint voices drifting through the fog. Kira stops, crouching low and motioning for Max to do the same. Through the haze, she spots the flickering beams of flashlights sweeping the ground. The search party is close, too close. She can hear their boots squelching in the mud, the occasional curse as one of them stumbles over a root or sinks knee-deep into the muck. They're moving clumsily, unused to the challenges of the swamp, but they're persistent. Brad is driving them hard, and she knows he's not far behind. Kira scans the area, her sharp eyes picking out the details that will shape her next move. A tangle of fallen trees lies ahead, their thick roots forming a natural barricade. Beyond that, the ground slopes into a shallow pool of water, its surface covered in thick algae. It's the perfect place for a trap. She doesn't have much time, but she doesn't need much. Moving swiftly, she gathers what she can find: vines, sharp branches, and loose rocks. She works with the precision of someone who's done this before, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She ties the vines across the path, just above the ground, creating trip hazards that will send anyone running through them sprawling into the mud. She positions the sharp branches at strategic angles, their points hidden beneath the surface, but ready to injure anyone who falls. It's crude but effective. Max watches her intently, his ears flicking back toward the approaching voices. Kira glances at him and whispers, "Stay close but be ready." The dog doesn't make a sound, but his posture shifts, his muscles taut with anticipation. The search party is almost upon them when Kira retreats to a hiding spot behind the fallen trees. She presses herself against the rough bark, her breath shallow as she listens to the men approach. "She's got to be around here somewhere," one of them says, his voice carrying through the still air. "Boss said she couldn't have gotten far." "Split up," another replies. "She's probably hiding. Check the water, she might have gone in." The men spread out, their flashlights casting long, wavering beams through the fog. Kira grips a heavy branch she found earlier, her fingers tightening around its rough surface. She's not planning to fight unless she has to, but she's ready for anything. The first man reaches the vines and trips almost immediately, his momentum sending him face first into the mud. He lets out a string of curses, flailing as he tries to get up, but before he can, Kira strikes. She swings the branch with all her strength, the impact knocking him unconscious. She drags him out of sight quickly, knowing the others will hear the commotion. "What the hell was that?" one of them shouts. Flashlights swing wildly, the beams converging on the spot where their comrade disappeared. Kira uses the distraction to move, circling around to their flank. Max follows her lead, his movements silent and deliberate. A second man stumbles over the vines, and this time Max is the one to strike. The dog barrels into him from the side, knocking him off his feet and pinning him to the ground. The man screams, but it's cut short as Max bares his teeth, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Kira appears beside them, her branch raised. "Stay down," she warns, her voice low and cold. The man freezes, his eyes wide with fear. The remaining men are in disarray, their confidence shattered by the sudden attacks. They shout to each other, their voices tinged with panic, but their confusion only makes them easier to pick off. Kira and Max move like shadows, striking quickly and disappearing before the others can react. By the time the chaos subsides, only one man remains standing. And then Brad arrives. The beam of his flashlight cuts through the fog like a blade, illuminating the carnage Kira has left in her wake. His expression is a mix of fury and disbelief as he takes in the unconscious bodies of his men, scattered like broken toys across the swamp. "You've got guts, Mitchell," he says, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I'll give you that. But you've made a big mistake." Kira steps out of the shadows, her posture calm but ready. Max stands beside her, his teeth bared in a silent warning. "The only mistake here," she replies, "was underestimating me." Brad raises his gun, aiming it directly at her. "This ends now," he snarls. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think you can just waltz in here and take me down? You're nothing. Just another bleeding heart who doesn't know her place." Kira doesn't flinch. Her eyes lock on his, and for a moment, the swamp is silent again. "You've already lost," she says, her voice steady. "You just don't know it yet." Before Brad can pull the trigger, Max lunges. The dog moves with blinding speed, knocking the gun from Brad's hand and sending him sprawling into the mud. Kira doesn't hesitate. She closes the distance in an instant, kicking the weapon out of reach and pinning Brad down with her knee. He struggles beneath her, his face twisted with rage, but she doesn't let up. "This is over," she says, her voice firm. "You're done." Brad glares up at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You think this changes anything?" He spits. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" Kira leans closer, her gaze hard as steel. "They'll believe the evidence," she replies. "And they'll believe him." She nods toward Max, who stands over them like a sentinel, his growl low and menacing. For the first time, Kira sees fear in Brad's eyes. He knows the game is up, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. The swamp is utterly silent, save for the ragged breaths of Brad as he lies pinned beneath Kira's weight. The oppressive humidity seems to press down on everything, wrapping the scene in a suffocating stillness. Kira's knee digs into Brad's back, her arms tensed as she keeps him immobilized. Max stands close, his sharp teeth bared in a silent warning, his amber eyes locked on the man who once mistreated him. Brad's confidence is shattered, his bravado now replaced by a flickering desperation. "You've made a mistake, Mitchell," he snarls through clenched teeth, though his voice lacks the venom it held before. "You think you're the hero here? You don't know how things work. No one's going to listen to you, especially not about me." Kira leans closer, her voice low and cold. "You're right about one thing, Brad," she says. "This swamp doesn't play fair, but unlike you, I've earned its respect, and tonight it's going to bury your lies." She grabs his wrist and flips him onto his back with practiced precision, the force of the motion sending a grunt of pain ripping from his throat. Max steps forward, his growl deep and guttural, as Kira picks up Brad's discarded radio from the mud. She presses the button, and the static-filled crackle of the police channel breaks the silence. "This is Officer Thompson," Kira says, imitating Brad's gruff tone with unsettling accuracy. "I've got a suspect fleeing west from my position. Need backup immediately." Brad's eyes widen as he realizes her intent. "What the hell are you doing?" he hisses, trying to push himself upright. But Kira shoves him back down with a strength born of sheer determination. Leveling the playing field, she replies simply. The radio crackles again, and a distorted voice responds. "Copy that, Thompson. Units are en route." Satisfied, Kira drops the radio into the mud and glares down at Brad. "You wanted me alone with no one to see what you do. Now your buddies are on their way, and they're going to see exactly what you've been up to." Brad's face twists into a snarl. "They'll believe me over you. They always will." Kira doesn't flinch. Instead, she pulls out her phone and holds it up, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light. "They don't have to believe me," she says. "They just have to see this." On the screen are the videos and photos she took at the poachers' camps, evidence of the illegal activities Brad has been protecting, of the corruption he's been at the center of. It's damning enough to destroy him, and he knows it. "You're bluffing," Brad says, though his voice wavers. Kira's expression hardens. "Try me." Suddenly, the sound of approaching engines cuts through the swamp, the headlights of patrol cars slicing through the mist. Kira stands, dragging Brad to his feet with one hand, while keeping a tight grip on his arm. Max stays close, his eyes flicking toward the lights but never leaving his target. "Looks like your audience is here," Kira says. "Time for your grand finale." As the first patrol car skids to a stop nearby, two officers step out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Their eyes widen as they take in the sight before them. Brad, disarmed and covered in mud, with Kira standing tall beside him and Max growling at his side. What the hell is going on here? One of the officers demands, his tone sharp and incredulous. Brad immediately finds his voice, his tone dripping with righteous indignation. "She attacked me," he shouts, pointing an accusatory finger at Kira. "She's been sabotaging our operations, setting traps, and putting all our lives at risk. Arrest her." The officers exchange uncertain glances, clearly caught off guard by the situation. Kira steps forward, her posture confident and commanding. "Don't believe a word he says," she snaps. "This man has been running an illegal poaching operation out of this swamp. I've got the evidence to prove it." She holds up her phone, the images on the screen glowing like a beacon in the darkness. "You'll find everything you need at the camps he's been protecting, locations, inventory, and even some of the men who are probably still licking their wounds." The officers hesitate, clearly unsure of how to proceed. One of them turns to Brad. "Is this true, Thompson? What's she talking about?" Brad's face flushes with anger and panic. "Of course not," he shouts. "She's lying. She's trying to cover her tracks. She's the one out here breaking the law." But the officers don't move, their doubt growing with every passing second. The tension is palpable, the air so thick with anticipation it feels almost suffocating. And then Max moves. The dog steps forward, his head low and his body tense, as if ready to attack. But instead of targeting Kiera, he positions himself directly in front of her, his stance protective. The officers exchange startled looks, clearly unsettled by the dog's behavior. Brad's protests falter as he realizes what's happening. Kiera places a steady hand on Max's back, her voice calm but firm. "This dog knows who the real threat is," she says. "You can believe him, or you can believe the man who's been lining his pockets at the expense of the law." The officers step back, their hands hovering near their holsters as they process the situation. Finally, one of them nods. "Let's sort this out at the station," he says, his tone carefully neutral. "Both of you are coming with us." Kiera nods, her gaze never leaving Brad. "Fine by me." As they lead Brad toward one of the patrol cars, his protests grow louder, more desperate. "You can't do this. She's lying. She's manipulating you." But his words fall on deaf ears. The officers have seen enough, and the evidence Kiera provided speaks louder than his bluster ever could. Before stepping into the patrol car herself, Kiera turns to Max, her voice soft. "Stay close," she says. The dog hesitates for a moment, then follows her to the car, jumping into the back seat beside her. As they drive away, the swamp fades into the distance, its mysteries and dangers swallowed by the night. But for Kiera, the fight is far from over. She knows the road ahead will be long and difficult, filled with challenges she can't yet foresee. But as she glances at Max, his head resting against her leg, she feels a renewed sense of purpose. Together they've faced the darkness of the swamp and come out stronger. And now, it's time to bring that fight to the light. The faint glow of dawn stretched across the swamp as Kiera stood at the edge of her porch, gazing out over the misty waters. The events of the past few days had left her physically exhausted and emotionally drained, but she knew this fight was far from over. Inside the police station, Brad Thompson was sitting in a holding cell, his face stripped of the smug superiority he once wore like armor. The evidence she had gathered, the photos, videos, and financial records, had been enough to force his superiors to detain him. But Kiera knew his arrest wasn't the end. Brad had been a blunt instrument, a soldier in a much larger war, and the people pulling his strings wouldn't let him go down without a fight. Max sat beside her, his body alert but relaxed, his amber eyes scanning the horizon. Kiera reached down and ran her fingers through his thick fur, grounding herself in his presence. "We're not done yet," she said quietly. Max didn't respond in any way other than a slow wag of his tail, but his posture told her he was ready. Always ready. The two of them had become a team again, just like in the old days, though the stakes felt even higher now. By mid-morning, the calls started coming. The first was from an officer who had seen Kiera's evidence and, while not directly corrupt, was clearly conflicted. His voice was low, tense. "Listen, Mitchell," he said, as though checking over his shoulder with every word. "Brad's people are already regrouping. You embarrassed them, and they don't take kindly to that. They're going to come after you. Hard." "Let them," Kiera said evenly, her voice calm but cold. "I'll be ready." The officer hesitated. "Look, you've already done enough damage to their operation. Maybe it's time to lay low. Give the heat time to die down." Kiera cut him off. "You don't get it. If I back down now, they'll just rebuild stronger. They'll find someone meaner than Brad to enforce their rules. Someone crueler, someone more dangerous. I'm not giving them that chance." The officer sighed, clearly frustrated. "Just be careful. These people, they played dirty. "They've already tried," she replied, hanging up before he could say more. She had no interest in further warnings. She knew the risks better than anyone. The fact that Brad's network was still intact and regrouping only confirmed what she already suspected. The arrest was just the first step, a small crack in the wall of corruption that surrounded Cypress Hollow. If she wanted to bring the whole thing down, she had to keep pressing. As the day wore on, Kira worked tirelessly to secure her position. She uploaded the evidence she had gathered to multiple secure servers, shared it with trusted contacts including a retired federal agent she knew from her military days, and prepared her cabin for the inevitable retaliation. She reinforced her windows and doors, secured escape routes, and rechecked her trail cameras to ensure there would be no blind spots around her property. Max followed her every step, his presence steady and reassuring. When night fell, Kira felt the swamp change around her. The once familiar sounds of crickets and frogs were now laced with a sense of tension, as though the very land itself was bracing for what was to come. She sat on the porch with Max at her side, her senses sharp, her mind focused. The fight wasn't over. It never was. And then, in the dead of night, they came. It started with a faint rustling in the bushes, almost imperceptible but enough to catch Max's attention. The dog stiffened, his ears swiveling toward the sound. Kira reached out and placed a steady hand on his back, her voice a whisper. "Stay calm, boy. Let's see what they're up to." Moments later, the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, followed by the low murmur of voices. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by masks, their movements cautious but deliberate. Kira counted 5 of them, each carrying some form of weapon: a crowbar, a bat, and one with a pistol tucked into his waistband. They crept toward the cabin, their intent clear: intimidation, destruction, or worse. Kira watched from her hiding spot inside, her breath steady as she assessed the situation. These weren't professionals, they were hired muscle, sent to scare her off or, failing that, to send a violent message. But she wasn't afraid. She had prepared for this. As the men reached the front porch, Max let out a low growl, his body coiled like a spring. Kira motioned for him to wait, her hand firm on his collar. The leader of the group tested the front door, giving it a light push. When it didn't budge, he grinned and stepped back, signaling for another man to bring the crowbar forward. That was when Kira struck. With a sharp whistle, she gave Max the signal, and the dog erupted from the shadows, a blur of muscle and fury. His first target didn't even have time to scream before Max knocked him to the ground, his teeth bared in a warning that left no room for argument. The other men froze, their flashlights swinging wildly as they tried to process what was happening. Kira stepped out onto the porch, her stance steady and unyielding. "Turn around and leave," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "You've got one chance. Don't waste it." The leader sneered, clearly unimpressed. "You think a dog's gonna scare us off?" he taunted, taking a step forward. "We're not here to play games, lady." Kira didn't flinch. "Neither am I," she replied. "Max, stay." The dog obeyed instantly, his growl deepening as he stood guard over the fallen man. Kira raised her phone, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. "This phone is streaming live to multiple secure locations," she said. "Your faces, your weapons, your voices, it's all being recorded. So, unless you want to spend the next 20 years in prison for armed assault, I suggest you walk away." The men hesitated, clearly weighing their options. The leader clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he realized he was losing control. Finally, he spat on the ground and barked an order to retreat. The group stumbled back into the darkness, dragging their injured companion with them. Kira watched them go, her expression unreadable. When the swamp fell silent once more, she crouched down beside Max, running her fingers through his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did great." The dog leaned into her touch, his tail wagging slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet, but Kira didn't sleep. She stayed on the porch with Max, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of further trouble. The attack had been sloppy, rushed. It wasn't the real retaliation. That would come later, when the people truly pulling the strings decided to make their move. But for now, she had won another battle. In the days that followed, Kira continued to build her case, working with the retired federal agent and other trusted allies to ensure the evidence reached the right hands. News of Brad's arrest and the raid on the poachers' camps began to spread, sparking quiet but growing unrest in Cypress Hollow. For some, Kira became a symbol of justice, a lone warrior standing against the corruption that had plagued the town for years. For others, she was a dangerous agitator, someone disrupting the fragile balance that kept the town running. Kira paid little attention to the rumors. Her focus remained on the fight ahead. She knew the people behind Brad's operation wouldn't go down without a fight. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. Max was by her side, and the bond they shared was stronger than ever. Together, they patrolled the swamp, reclaiming it as a sanctuary for those who respected it, and a warning to those who sought to exploit it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the swamp in hues of gold and orange, Kira stood at the water's edge, Max sitting beside her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she felt a quiet confidence in the stillness of the moment. The swamp had tested her, broken her down, and rebuilt her stronger than ever. And now it was her turn to fight for it. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Kira and Max would face it together, unbroken, unyielding, and ready for whatever came next.